Welcome to the third and final session of our Year 5 virtual conference for the CSAIL. My name is Andy Porter, and next slide. We're using live captioning, and there's how you can get it. Next, oh yeah, okay. Now, first I want to introduce our project officer, James Benson. James is at the Institute for Education Sciences, which funds the CSAIL. He's a sociologist with a degree from that great university in the Midwest, University of Wisconsin. And he is a first-rate scholar as well. In just as one indicator of that, he won the Palmer Johnson Award for Best Article in an AERA journal a couple years back. James, I'd like to hear a few words from you.
Yeah, thank you, Andy. It's been a nice introduction and also good working with you over the last 5 years. And I look forward to the next year as well. I also want to thank the CSAIL team for presenting your findings this morning and to conducting a nice set of breakout sessions. Over the last 2 years, I have reviewed findings from each of the CSAIL teams as findings have emerged from your studies. In 2 important ways, the CSAIL findings confirm expectations that IES had for the Standards in Schools Center when we wrote the request for application 6 years ago. First, college and career-ready standards, which embody complex interlacings of content standards, cognitive demand levels, and standards of practice, would be and have been difficult for districts, schools, and teachers to implement. Second, implementation has posed specific challenges for educators of students with disabilities and English learners. As I have reviewed findings from the longitudinal outcomes study team, and as I have received reports and presentations from the National Center for Education Statistics on their analysis of recent data from the National Assessment of Educational Progress, I have found myself profoundly discouraged by the lack of progress on a national level toward improving achievement for lower achieving students over the last 10 years. When the Common Core state standards were adopted in 2010, I, along with many others, hoped that the standards would lead to more substantial narrowing of the gaps between our highest and lowest achieving students than had occurred during the NCLB period. It seemed reasonable to believe in progress toward this goal, given that the new standards were more rigorous than many states' standards at the time. Unfortunately, several key gaps have widened during the last 10 years, and in retrospect, the NCLB years look like a time of progress, especially in mathematics. Thus, I find myself asking a new and different set of questions for researchers and policymakers today. First, are college and career-ready standards an effective way of organizing instruction in states, districts, and schools that take them seriously over an extended period of time? And I mean by that over years, with consistent endorsement and support by states and districts. And I'm thinking about recent research that has been conducted in the Chicago public schools as well as the state of Tennessee. Number 2, have we asked too much of teachers, especially those serving in under-resourced districts, during this transition to college and career-ready standards? Have we asked them to be education researchers, curriculum developers, pedagogical wizards, and classroom managers all at the same time? And question number 3, Is fiscal austerity constraining the ability of districts and schools to implement advanced curricula and to recruit and train teachers to implement them? Are educators' efforts to address educational inequality being hampered by the limitations of federal and state efforts to address the everyday needs of the K-12 student population and their families? Excuse me. These pressing needs often prioritize access to quality housing, healthcare, and social services over the purchase of laptop computers and internet service and the completion of homework assignments. So with that said, I will turn the mic over to Andy Porter, and I look forward to hearing from Linda Darling-Hammond.
Thank you very much, James. I feel the same with you. You've been a great project officer, and I appreciate it. So now I'm introducing our main speaker of the session, Linda Darling-Hammond. She's the Charles E. Ducommun Professor of Education Emeritus at Stanford. She recently became the president of the California State Board of Education, one of our partner states, I might notice. And she and I'm a little bit older than she is, but we've had a long time together. And as far as I can tell, and without really checking it, she's won just about every major award and honor and gotten every accolade that a person in education research can get. So that's point one. And point two is that she is, in my view, one of the most influential education thinkers of all time. So it's great, Linda, to have you with us today. Linda, turn on your video, and yeah, there she is, just as good looking as ever. And
oh, thank you.
And she's going to make some remarks, and then maybe if we have some time, we'll have some Q&A. And yeah, take it away.
Great. Great to see you, and wonderful to be in this conversation with you. We've been in a conversation about standards-based reform for many years, and I want to make a couple of remarks about the question of, can standards-based reform work? And I'm putting that in the context of, what does it take to build a system? Because I'll argue that I think if we look historically, standards-based reforms have been meaningful when they've been part of a systemic reform. Next slide. So as you've been talking about, of course, today the U.S. has two achievement gaps. We have the gap between white and more affluent students in the U.S. and those students of color and those living in poverty, a growing share of our student population who are continuing to achieve at lower levels in general. And then there's the gap between the U.S. and other high-achieving nations that have made substantial gains over the last 30 or 40 years. And I think that's an important part of the question as well. What do we see happening in those systems that are making those gains? Next slide. So despite years of standards-based reform and high-stakes testing, U.S. scores have declined on the international PISA tests between 2000 and 2015. 2000 was just before NCLB came online. 2015 was when it ended. Next slide. And we've seen, you know, kind of this ongoing gap in that the and colleagues have done to sort of look at of recent reforms. But you can see that the largest, I think I'm having audio challenges, and maybe I should try to dial in to be heard. Are you hearing me okay? Can somebody just pop
Linda,
in?
Linda, this is Nicole, your host. I think the first thing we want to try is to actually have you turn off webcam. I hate that we won't be able to see you, but we can hear you, and let's try that first. If you would
How's that?
just, that sounds good. And then Linda, let's keep going. If we need
Okay.
to have you dial in, I'll let you know. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So anyway, there's a huge decline in the gap in the 70s and early 80s, and then it grew again because of a change of policies in the 1980s that eliminated many of the reforms of the war on poverty and the Great Society that were changing the context for students' lives, but also desegregating schools, engaging in school finance reforms that reduced inequalities of many kinds there. But there was no standards-based reform at that time. There was a beginning of standards-based reform in the 1990s, and we can see that some kids began to do better, but the gap did grow again and has been continuing in a like manner since then. Next slide. Those were the math scores. These are the reading scores. You can see the decline in the gap was even bigger in reading than in math, but the gap has reopened, and this slide doesn't show it all the way to 2019, but the gap is now 30% larger today than it was 30 years ago. Next slide. So what does this have to say about standards-based reform? Is standards-based reform, quote unquote, not working? Next slide. I just want to go back to the theory of standards-based reform. We did have one iteration and one era in the 1990s that took hold in states across the country. We did see some gains in some states from that era. And then we did another round with state standards and the next generation science standards. But the theory of standards-based reform, as it was put out by Mike Smith and Jennifer O'Day, can you go back a slide, Nicole? Thank you, was that it was to set clear goals for what students would know and be able to do, develop the curriculum and assessments, align standards for educators, and then to ensure professional learning around the standards, to ensure that there were quality materials and additional investments where needed, and use evidence of progress to guide the investments. And this is the piece that I think is important in understanding what's happened since. Next slide. Many states, however, in this era have had testing focused on lower level tests, which have driven a different kind of curriculum than the one intended by the standards. There's been very uneven training for teachers, and in many states, a large number of teachers coming in with no preparation before they enter the classroom. Usually these teachers are in the schools that teach the highest need students. We've had a lot of popcorn reforms, innovations that come and go. And in many states, we have deeply inequitable funding of schools. 38 states do not spend more on the education of students with greater needs than the education of those with fewer needs. And in about half of our states, it's the reverse. The rich get richer and the poor get poorer. Next slide. And of course, U.S. child poverty rates are the highest in the industrialized world. Homelessness increased during the Great Recession for children, food insecurity, and we're seeing, of course, another hit in that regard right now in this moment of COVID that is deepening inequalities. Next slide. But notice that in that era where I showed the tremendous gains in achievement and reduction of the gap, that the percent of children in poverty in the 1960s was cut by half in one decade. And that was the decade that really signaled, the big changes in achievement. It has now crept back up to not quite the level that it was in the 1950s. Next slide. So what are the highest achieving nations doing differently? All of them do have standards-based reform. In fact, the Common Core standards were designed to emulate some of the standards in other countries that were fewer, higher, and deeper. Next slide. But we see in the highest performing nations, and I've studied those in the flat world and in empowered educators, that you get a very integrated system of teaching and learning. It's a much more systemic approach where school funding is equitable with more funding in the places that have greater needs. 21st century curriculum and assessments are tied together, so assessments and curriculum go together, not separately. Investments in quality teaching are very profound. People come into teaching in high quality programs that are completely free to them in places like Finland and Singapore. They get mentoring on a regular basis tied to the curriculum and the assessment strategy. The schools are designed for teacher learning. They have anywhere from 8 to 15 hours a week of additional time beyond what our teachers have for collaboration and learning. And then there are many, many supports for child welfare and early learning. Very few children live in poverty, and even when they do, they have much greater support for their basic needs. Next slide. So some states achieve at those high international levels. We're used to hearing about Massachusetts, which has been ranking #1 since its big reforms in the early 1990s. Connecticut was one that followed on its heels. New Jersey is a surprise, and I want to speak about that in particular in a moment. And those states actually have followed a trajectory of systemic reform that is much more like what we see in other countries and much less like what we see in other states that have on the surface done, quote, standards-based reform, but have not embedded it in a systemic initiative. Next slide. So the Massachusetts and Connecticut reforms that were tied to their student standards, their new student standards in the 1990s, both of them used high quality open-ended assessments that really got at the deeper elements of the standards. They both had major equalization and increase in funding, preschool, child health investments, standards for educator preparation went way up, big investments in teacher salaries so they could recruit people who could meet the standards, and professional learning, and did that for more than 15 years. Next slide. North Carolina was another one in the 1990s that was 48th in the nation in math, and you can see there the green line on this slide. In 1990, tremendous investments over the course of the 1990s with their standards-based reform. By 2000, they were above the national average in math, the largest gains in achievement and the largest decrease in the achievement gap of any state in the nation in the 1990s. They've stayed above the national average until they started to seriously cut their budgets in 2011, 2012, 2013. And I'll note that part of the tracking of these questions of standards-based reform is that in 2008, of course, we had a huge recession. In 2010, that hit the schools because the ARRA Act had run out, and we had tremendous declines in funding that hit the highest need districts the most. Next slide. So in North Carolina, which had these huge gains, we saw a very comparable set of reforms to the ones I just described, which also included emphasizing things like national board certification, 12% increase in salaries for those folks, and a huge influx of very, very well-prepared teachers who then became coaches around the standards. The assessments were chosen to emulate NAEP-like testing. So those decisions were thoughtful about the standards, and then they invested in all of the surround that allowed the standards to be well implemented. The next slide. I did a study around that time which looked at the factors explaining achievement on the NAEP and found that the strongest predictor was the percentage of teachers with full certification and a major in their field, so the teacher quality dimensions. The biggest negative impact was the percent of newly hired uncertified teachers, and that's an issue in many, many states. Per pupil spending mattered, but as many other studies have found out, it was the equalization of funding so that students in high need communities got more money that made the biggest difference. Next slide. New Jersey, I wanted to mention, it is a very surprising thing to see it having climbed so much in the achievement rankings. It is a majority minority state with a high proportion of low-income students and special education students. Next slide. And during the later part of the 1990s, when their reforms went into place, they began to climb and close the achievement gap. In their first decade of reform, they did find that they got to the point where Black and Latino kids in New Jersey outscored the average kid in California, which was meanwhile disinvesting in its schools. Next slide. Those achievement trends continued, and you can see the gains. This is in mathematics. You can also see the Chris Christie dip that happened after 2013 as funding was reduced in the schools and some of the reforms were undone. but those have been put back in place. Next slide. And now New Jersey is, first in the country in 8th grade writing, second in 8th grade reading and math, second in graduation rate. And the way in which they implemented their standards, which were in a context, again, of very thoughtful, rich assessments and investments in teacher quality and learning, allowed them to overcome what a lot of states would argue is, a huge impediment to their forward momentum on achievement. Next slide. So again, the same kind of agenda that we saw in other states occurred there, along with whole school reform models. I just want to note that New York spends the same amount of money. It ranks about at the average of all states rather than near the top. But the policy mix is very, very different. They've never equalized funding. Curriculum and assessments have been a hot mess. They've started and stopped a whole number of tests. They had a very difficult unfolding of the Common Core state standards. They did not make the investments initially in teacher and leader learning. They put high stakes before they put learning opportunities. They've had a very difficult time getting a child safety net put in place. So the policies that accompany the standards-based reforms make a big difference. Next slide. So when standards-based reform becomes systemic, you can see these sets of strategies around not only the way in which the curriculum is brought online, the standards are brought online, the assessment system is enabled to match, which is not true in too many states. The investments in teacher quality and learning are made, and in adequacy for funding, you see these very different outcomes. Next slide. So a system that is systematic actually has all of the system components working in mutually reinforcing ways. You can see this in a lot of other countries. The policies and programs affect all of the schools and teachers, not just a little bit of a pilot here and a little bit of a thing over there. And some schools that are, able to manage it do well, and other schools are left to languish, but they really have a complete systemic approach with the training and the funding that are needed to engage the implementation. Next slide. When California implemented Common Core state standards, and I will say we are still very much involved in that, and our state is very committed to the standards. This was my predecessor on the state board's sort of slide for what we had to do to align policy, looking for policy gaps, conflicts around curriculum, principal and teacher investments and policy, college readiness. We have standards that were written for English learners along with non-native English speakers. Special education accountability systems were redefined, and school funding also was put in place that was much more equitable. And we have seen California go from 48th and 49th in the country respectively in 8th grade reading and math to almost all the way to the national average in reading in just about 5 years of implementing this set of reforms, and closing about half the gap to the national average in math. So it's not a top of the country story, but it is a story of some success in implementing the standards in a coherent way. Next slide. So if we wanted to get to what the anatomy of equity and achievement is, it would really include these systemic elements of supports for children, equitable school resources, investments in well-prepared and well-supported educators. The 21st century curriculum assessment then sits on top of all of those other elements to produce the kind of innovative and effective schools we're looking for. And that's the last slide.
Thank you very much. That was very useful and interesting. It sounded to me kind of like an endorsement of standards-based reform as it was originally thought about some 30 years ago. That's about when that O'Day and Smith article came out, and they were all wrapped up together. That they were tied together because the standards were the goal, the lead of the systemic reform, and then everything came in. And then you say, well, it still makes sense to me. But I say it's worked, but with a lot of variability, and this variability you pointed out as well. So it brings me to the question: why does it work? Are some people just not faithful to it and not trying hard, or what's the deal? Why does it work sometimes and not others? And then just to salt it a little bit, you used that dirty word money quite a few times, and I myself like money, and so I can understand that. But we just experiencing this pandemic, and I think we're going to go. Our country's going to be busted here. I mean, we're spending money in a wise way. Well, when it works, when they get the money out to the people who need it. But we're in a heck of a hole here. So if money's the key, what's going on? And then the third thing is this: I think more people in the United States today understand the importance of and love education and teachers in our schools because they're stuck with their kids. And so I think now's the time to hit them up. So what do you got to say to all that?
Yeah, well, I do think that money is part of it. And one of the things I showed you, the trajectory we were on in the 70s and, into the beginning of the 80s, and the gap closed by half in that period of time. And then, it reopened. And the policies that have been behind that, some of them were money, some were, they all come back to money in some way, probably. But, there was investments in more equitable spending. There was, the war on poverty, all that. The discourse in the 1980s became money doesn't matter. That was a very deliberate discourse that was created in the 1980s to say we don't have to worry about all these inequalities. We are the most unequal system in the industrialized world in terms of how we underwrite schools. And we do that in most states, except for the places like Massachusetts and some of the others that I pointed out. New Jersey, Massachusetts, now California are now spending money equitably. But if you starve the schools that serve the kids with the greatest needs, and they get a continual cycle of teachers who are untrained and don't stay very long, and if they get professional development, it walks out the door with them, and they've got other needs that need to be attended to so that they can be ready to learn without anxiety and hunger and so on. You got to make those investments. When we've made those investments and other countries make those investments routinely, we see much better learning outcomes. And it just isn't true that money doesn't matter. Rucker Johnson and Carabo Jackson have done a series of studies showing how over the period of time when school finance reforms were coming in place, the places that put as much as even 20% more into the education of low-income kids over the 12 years of their schooling had graduation rates 20+ percentage points higher, greater educational attainment, elimination of the adult poverty gap that we would otherwise see. So yes, money does matter. And a lot of places have said, well, it's just the standards. It's just having these great standards and curriculum and assessments. And tests don't teach children. Teachers do, and teachers have to be educated, enabled, supported. They've got to make a living wage if you want them to stay in the profession, all of those things. Yes. So now what about the hole we're in now? Well, we've had multi-trillions of dollars in recovery acts coming from the federal government. Out of all those many trillions of dollars thus far, the amount spent on education, 30 billion. So way, 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 way under 1%. We have not made the commitment to stabilize schools, to enable them to continue the work that they're doing. The money is there, and this is the question that we're going to have in the coming year and years ahead for the United States. Are we going to allocate the money in a way that will actually help our economy in a variety of ways that people, I think, aren't anticipating right now in terms of the investments in education, and just allowing parents, as you said, to get back to work and to not have to be taking care of their kids. Right. So we're going to see whether those investments are made. If they are not made at the federal level right now, given the extent of this pandemic, I think we are looking at the fall of Rome. I think we're looking at the beginning of the end for the United States being a world-class country in terms of the way in which kids, in terms of the way education is supported and the way in which kids are supported. We can't starve the kids and system in the highest need places indefinitely. And the reason I gave those success stories, and they continue to be, is these are places that are investing a lot more. You know, Massachusetts, Vermont is often at the top as well, New Jersey, Connecticut. They're spending $18,000 a kid more equitably than they used to on the education of teachers and leaders who can implement the standards in good ways. And they're maintaining a level of resources now, whether and achievement. Whether they can continue without support in this moment is a big question. But the places that have been disinvesting in schools are going to fall off the cliff.
Yeah, I would just underline what you kind of talked about when you said money matters. Money matters, especially if you spend it wisely. So it's not, you know, Kansas City taught us that once a long time ago. They got a lot of money for desegregation and they didn't spend it wisely and they didn't get any benefits to student achievement. But I would just, we're at the end of our time here and it's too bad because it's so much fun talking with you. I would say that standards-based reform, I think, would you agree, for some people, it's very difficult to implement well.
Absolutely. It's hard to implement well, and to do it well, you've got to make those investments in people's learning. It's hard to do, but if you make the investments, I think all children can learn. I think all teachers and school leaders can learn. We do see that making the investments can make a big difference, but it is hard to do well. It's sophisticated teaching, as you have shown us over so many years. It takes pedagogical thinking and skill, and so it doesn't happen without very skillful investments in the learning process for the adults as well.
Well, Linda, thank you very much for your thoughts and your wisdom. We are at the end of our time. Thank you, attendees, audience, for your participation here. And I have one slide to show you before we go off, and that is that all of this has been recorded and will be on our website, csail.org/videos. And if you have any questions about today's events, here's an email that you can contact. And also, remember, you could send in questions as a part of this conference format. And if you haven't done so already, I encourage you to do it. So thank you again, Linda. Thank you, James. And thank you, Jackie Kerstetter and Nicole, for setting this up. And I wish you all a good rest of the day.
Great to see you. Thank you.
Goodbye.